So one thing that right-wing and left-wing people converge on are, well, two things. One is that critical race theory comes out of the Frankfurt School and is Marxist. And the other thing that they converge on is that China is Marxist. Now, the idea of China being Marxist is complicated. You can go to, because in China there is kind of like a voluntary spirit that goes against kind of that neoliberal nihilism that you find in the city in San Francisco, for example. This like capitalist nihilism, the desert where everything, all value is turned into a cost benefit analysis. So that nihilism, yeah, it does exist in Beijing, but also when you go into the different communities, you can find that there's a lot of community there and a lot of communal volunteerism and people doing stuff, um, because maybe now there's social capital points, but that's a different point. Now, the social capital thing is completely different. That's a different type of neoliberal. So I'm talking about that there's, within the villager spirit, there's like a kind of a volunteerism. And that volunteerism also exists in the right wing circle as well. The gated communities that, Girl Scouts or Guy Scouts or whatever it's called. And, there is a type of volunteerism in America as well. And, of course, these days it's been getting more eroded. But it's funny how in, conservative right wing communities, there is a spirit of volunteerism, even though they're the capitalists. And within the poor communities, we can see that interpersonal relationships are more commodified and prostitution is rampant. So that's an interesting. So the commodification of emotional labor is something that actually affects the underclass more, in fact, than the the people who have the luxury of living in gated communities. Now, that's one convert. So those two convergences. So that's a idea of China being Marxist, and China being Marxist is complicated. Again, it has a villager spirit. It's not a Marxism. That's what I'm talking about right now. And so that's the closest kind of socialism I see in China. And so what I find interesting is to see those convergences between the neoliberal left, and the conservative perspective. Now, let's take a look at this 30-minute best explanation of Marxism video, and I'm going to be interjecting and responding as we go along. So let's take a look.
Hello, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I want to address something Tom just said, which is, in fact, that woke is supposed to advance equity in Europe. So here's the definition of equity, and see if it sounds like a definition of anything else you've ever heard of. The definition of equity comes from the public administration literature. It was written by a man named George Frederickson. And the definition is an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. Does that sound like anything you've heard of before? Like socialism. They're going to administer an economy to make shares equal. The only difference between equity and socialism is the type of property that they redistribute, the type of shares. They're going to redistribute social and cultural capital in addition to economic and material capital. And so this is my thesis when we say, what is woke? Woke is Maoism with American characteristics, if I might borrow from Mao himself, who said that his philosophy was Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics, which means woke is Marxism. That's a very provocative statement. It's something you will certainly hear it is not, that it is different. And the professors and the philosophers will spend a large amount of time explaining to you why. No, it's about economics when it's Marxism. This is social, this is cultural, this is different. It's not different. I need you to think biologically for one moment. And I don't mean about your bodies. We could do that. That's a different topic. I want you to think how we organize plants and animals when we study them. They're species, but above species there are the genus of the animals. So you think like the cats, all the cats, but you have tigers, you have lions, you have house cats, you have whatever, leopards, many different kinds of cats. If we think of Marxism as a genus of ideological thought, then classical economic Marxism is a species, radical feminism is a species in this same genus, critical race theory is a species in this genus, queer theory is a species in this genus, post-colonial theory that's plaguing Europe is a species in this genus, and they have something that binds them together called intersectionality that makes them treated as if they are all one thing. But the logic is Marxist, and I want to convince.
Oh man, see, this is what the left has created. We've put
you of that
all these
because
people
Marx
in
had
the same camp, and now
very simple proposition, but we get lost. We think that Marx was talking about economics.
that's what I mean when I say intersectionality killed socialism.
Because he often talked about economics. He wrote a book called Capital. It's a very famous book. And we think, well, this is about economic theory, but this isn't true. It's only true on the surface. If we go below the surface, what Marx was talking about was something different. We know what Marx's hypothesis was that we must seize the means of production if we're going to bring socialism to the nations, to the world. We have to seize the means of production. So we have to ask, what does he mean? And if we think that it's about capital, then we miss what he means. If you think it's about the means of production in the factory with a hammer, the means of production in the field with a sickle, then you miss what it means. Because Marx explained what makes human beings special in his earlier writings. And what makes human beings special is that man is a being that is incomplete and knows that he is incomplete. He is a man whose true nature has been forgotten to him, which is social being. He is a socialist at heart who doesn't realize it. And the reason he doesn't realize it is because of the economic conditions operating as a means of construction or production, not just of the economy, but of him, but of man, of society, and particularly of history. Marx said that he had the first scientific study of history. How is history produced? By man, doing man's activity. And man's key activity was economic activity, as he saw it. And so economic production doesn't just produce the goods and services of the economy, it produces society itself. And society, in turn, produces man. He called this the inversion of praxis. And so when he says we must seize the means of production, and he's talking about factories and fields, he's actually talking about how we construct who we are as human beings so that we might complete ourselves, so that we might complete history. And at the end of history, mankind will remember that he is a social being, and we will have a socialist society, a perfect communism that transcends private property, is how he put it. He said, in fact, that communism is the transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement. That's a quote from the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. So Marx was interested in controlling, or understanding and controlling, how man produces himself. He writes about this exclusively in the 1840s. Very deeply. How do we do this? And he looks at the economic conditions and he says, this is where it is. And that's why we get economic Marxism. And that's why we think Marx was an economist. But Marx was never an economist. He was a theologian.
That's correct. Marx was not an economist. He was a theologian. And that's basically my position as well. And that's the interesting thing about these conservatives. Look, he has a smirk on his face. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly it. Okay, so yeah, Marx is a theologian. And capitalism is a theology, my friend. The whole capitalist system is a theology. Check out my Ritual Traces series. That's what it is.
He wanted to produce a religion for mankind that would supersede all of the religions of mankind and bring him back to his true social nature. Mm-hmm. This is the true fact of Marx. And what the goal was, like I said, is to complete man. So what he said is, well, how are we building man currently? All of his economic...
Yes. How are we building the socialist utopia in the so-called critical race theory intersectionality perspective that transforms all human social relationships into cost-benefit analysis of commodities? How is that socialist? That's not socialist, my friend. Critical race theory is not from the Frankfurt School. Check out my History of Feminism series.
Analysis
History of
is about how are we...
race theory and feminism, professional gaslighters.
Building man at present through what he called material determinism. And he said, well, what we have is a special form of private property in our society. Our society is organized around private property. And so all of our thoughts organize around private property. In other words, there's a special kind of property that the bourgeois elite class has access to, and then they organize society to exclude everybody else from access to that property through exploitation, through alienation.
Exactly. That's what's happening with AI, right? So what's happening with AI is like we go to, Chat GPT or Bard, they scrape the internet for information, and then so they're scraping, they're exploiting the surplus labor of all of our work from the internet, and then putting a patent on it, or putting a label on it, or putting a watermark on it, and saying this belongs to Google. Excuse me, this doesn't belong to Google. Google stole it from the internet and then had a formula to curate it. Okay, that formula to curate it was AI. Okay, great. But it's still the material product. The material was from us. That's exactly what it's doing.
Through estrangement.
That's what property is. That's what the patents are. He just explained that. So I just explained the best version of it. The best version of it is the most neoliberal, most up-to-date version of it is what's happening with patent law right now with AI. There's nothing more up-to-date than that to understand what's going on.
And so what Karl Marx was proposing is the economic...
And it is estrangement. Because what's happening? ChatGPT is taking all of our information, giving it back to us, selling it back to us. It's not for free. It's not OpenAI anymore. It's called OpenAI. It's not OpenAI.
Becomes a vehicle to separate society into a bourgeois class that has access to a special form of property. The people who have access wish to retain that, so they oppress people and keep other people out of that.
Now let's think of it with technology in our modern day perspectives. Like people who know how to use technology, people who are the cyborgs will get ahead.
special form of property. They erect a system of classism to do that. It's enforced by an ideology called capitalism that believes that this is the right way to engage in the world. And what we have to do is awaken the underclass, the proletariat, to the real conditions and the fact that they are historical agents of change, and bring them to do a revolution and transform society so that we would have equity or socialism, whichever word you want. They have the same definition. Now, let's say that we step out. We step back from this species, this economic species, Homo economicus, and we step back to the genus, and we look at this idea, a special form of property that segregates society into people who have, the bourgeois, and the people who do not have, who are in class conflict with an ideology that keeps this in place. And the underclass must awaken with consciousness to fight back and to seize the means of production of that form of deterministic property. And now we say, change out class, put in race, and watch. We get critical race theory falls out of the hat, just like.
And see, so that's he just skipped a lot of history right there, and that's he just falls out of a hat. Whereas that's like 50 years of like what's going on, which I discuss in my professional gaslighters and history of critical race theory and feminism video.
Like that. Very simple. In 1993, Cheryl Harris wrote a long article for the Harvard Law Review called Whiteness as Property. She explained that whiteness, or white privilege, constitutes a kind of cultural private property. She says it must be abolished in order to have racial justice. Just like Karl Marx said that in the Communist Manifesto, he wrote, communism can be summarized in a single sentence, the abolition of private property. Well, this is why critical race theory calls to abolish whiteness, because whiteness is a form of private property. People who have access to this property are whites, or white adjacent, or they act white. These are words out of the American lexicon that they've used to describe how people gain access to the private property. People without that are people of color, and they are oppressed by systemic racism. Systemic racism is enforced by an ideology of white supremacy instead of capitalism.
And so you can see that in that situation, class doesn't really matter anymore. It's something else. It's something completely different. And that's not Marxism. That's something different. That's a historical trauma. That is, that's Afro-pessimism. This is something different. It's not.
If you think of whiteness as a form of cultural capital, white supremacy, as they define it, is identical to capitalism. It's the belief, it's not.
So cultural capital, that could be, there's so many ways to define that. I mean,
believing that white people are superior. It's believing that white people have access to the control of society and should maintain that, even if you don't actually believe that. If you merely support that, you have adopted the ideology of white supremacy into your mind. And so you have the exact same system. And the goal is to awaken a racial consciousness in people so that they will band together as a class and seize the means of cultural production so that white cultural production is no longer the dominant mode. It's a big mystery in Europe, I know, in the UK, throughout Europe, I hear this question again and again. Why on earth is this very American phenomenon about slavery and so on that doesn't apply to our country? Why is it popular here? It's because it's not about history at all. It's not about slavery at all.
Yeah, it's the reason why it's, what it's about is about imposing neoliberal subjectivity. And what does that mean? Is about having everybody constantly doing privilege calculations. When we're all doing privilege calculations about all of these things, so it's about intersectionality, not just about race, but all of these types of things, we're always doing this kind of. That's why I'm saying it's a traumatic rumination, right? So, what critical race theory and feminism are is basically imposing a rumination of a certain population onto the rest of society. And the reason why they do this is because when you impose that rumination, you are vicariously spreading trauma. And by vicariously spreading trauma, what you're doing is you're actually making the population more productive. Why? Is because everybody has this incessant need for security. We all have this insatiable insecurity in our brain, right? So, and we basically exploit that. The CIA, basically, not we, the CIA exploits that from vulnerable populations, from highly hysterical populations, because they've had, legitimate historical abuse, right? So women, black people, whatever. So all these different groups. And so basically what you take that trauma and you spread it across the world. So why do you spread it why do you spread it to Africa? And, why do you spread intersectionality to Africa? And because it's a universalistic perspective, and then with that universalist perspective, you can basically expand neoliberal, farming, tax farms. That's basically what's going on. So you're making everybody more productive. You're making everybody run around for growth. It's the opposite of degrowth. So my friend Aaron Vensenstein, he has and I could never pronounce his name. He has a new book on degrowth. And, he has a section on there on feminism, and he has to, I don't know, I think he believes in it, and we disagree in this stuff. Um, you know, he you have to bow down to, like, I'm trying to grant money for something. You have to repeat those hive mind idioms in order to participate in the system. So you have to do privilege calculations in order to participate in the system. And why do you have to do privilege calculations? Is because it's a psychological trauma that they're imposing on us, so that they can control us, so that they can make everybody more productive. That's the point. When you're constantly traumatized about, this, I should do this or that, okay, to have value in society, to be loved. I need to be loved in society. So how can I be loved in society when everybody wants a 6-foot guy or whatever, right? So I better make mad money. So all of these hive mind idioms are, that's what it's for. That's why feminism exists, is to make everybody more productive. That's the whole fucking point. That's it doesn't say that. It says it's socialism. It says it's about redistribution of wealth. Sure, that's the gaslighting, right? So our interpersonal relationships have become commodified. And that's basically what this guy is rebelling against. That's basically what the conservatives are rebelling against, is the fact that the interpersonal relationships are commodified, and that's not usually what they have to deal with, right? What they usually have to deal with is outside their community, that the commodification is happening, not within their community. And that's what feminism has done. We bring it within our, not just in our communities, in our interpersonal relationships, but in our own mind, in even the deepest recesses of our own mind. It's made by psychologists, and psychologists have been doing the neoliberal, imposing neoliberal, what's called psychosomatic, psychocompulsion. So they have been psychocompulsing society for the last 50 years now. And it's easy to critique the American there's the American Psychological Association and the Psychiatry Association. And man, the Psychiatry Association is so evil. There's the wooziness. Sorry, I'm going out of...
Those are excuses that they use. It's about creating a class consciousness that's against this form of property called whiteness, that's against the dominant culture that may just be a matter of fact, say, if you're in Europe. That's why. Because it becomes a site by which people can come together and they can channel resentment and try to claim power. I wrote a book called Race Marxism, and I defined critical race theory as it really is. In that book, on the first page, I said that critical race theory is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. But couldn't we say the same about Marxism? It's calling everything you want to control bourgeois until you control it. But those mean the same thing. They mean exactly the same thing. But what about, say, queer theory?
Wait. It's calling everything bourgeois until you control it. Kind of a straw man of... I thought he had a...
How is that Marxist? It's very strange, all this gender and sex and sexuality. Well, Tom said, what does woke attack? The idea of being normal. Well, the queer theory thinks that there are certain people who get to set the norms of society. They are privileged. They call themselves normal. They say this is normal. It's normal to consider yourself a man and look like a man and act like a man and dress like a man and eat meat like a man. And then there are women that should be feminine and pretty and all these things. And so they get to define what's normal. They're heterosexuals, so they get to define the heterosexuality as normal and other sexualities are abnormal. And so you have a conflict across this cultural property of who gets to be considered normal and who is a pervert or a freak or some other term that gets used in their literature. But technically, who is a queer? Which sounds like a slur, but they adopted it, and it's a technical academic term now. It means an identity without an essence, by the way. An identity that is strictly oppositional to the concept of the normal, as defined by queer theorist David Halperin in his 1995 book, Saint Foucault, Toward a Gay Hagiography. I didn't make that up. I'm not extrapolating. So you see, queer theory is just another species of the genus of Marxism. What about post-colonial theory, which is plaguing Europe, thanks to Frantz Fanon and his biggest European fan, Jean-Paul Sartre? What about this? What's the same? You have the West as the oppressor. They have access to the material and cultural wealth of the world because they've decided their culture is the default and have gone and colonized the world to bring culture to the world, as they say. And so the oppressed, the natives around the world, the people have to band together, and their activity is going to be called decolonization. They have to remove every aspect of Western culture. So when they come to Belgium or they come to France or they come to the United States and they say we're going to decolonize the curriculum, or they go to the UK and say we're going to decolonize Shakespeare. This is what they mean. We're going to remove the cultural significance of your cultural artifacts because those cultural artifacts themselves...
This is what happens when, the whole process of decolonization is realizing that everybody needs to decolonize. Europeans need to decolonize. What does it mean for Europeans to decolonize? It means to look back at, the Westphalian state structure that forced France to colonize itself, to erase its own history, to erase as many histories, right? That forced the Cultural Revolution. So you're talking about Mao, but Mao is just a response to what happened in the Westphalian state. What am I talking about, the Westphalian state? Westphalian state Treaty of Westphalia, we're talking about Max Weber and the theory of the office. This is basically basic political theory. What the fuck is this guy doing? How do these people? I mean, these guys don't even study basic political theory. Right? So, oh my goodness. So, there's always been a process of internal colonization first. And what is that process of internal colonization? It's forgetting who you are. It's creating an idea of whiteness that is bland. Whiteness is bland. I mean, what's categorized as whiteness? I mean, it's your specific tribe that matters. Your specific dance from your specific mountain. Are you from Switzerland or from Lithuania or the Caucasus Mountains? Are you from Georgia? What kind of white are you? What kind of whiteness itself is a blandness. It's like it's almost like Frenchness. Frenchness has a more of an identity to it because it's almost like anti-monarchy, Vive la France and all that stuff. Anybody can be French in a way, just like anybody can be an American in a way. But so it has a double knife to it, double edge to it. You erase your past, but you can also create some type of creolization, like Persians, right? Persian is a kind of creolization. Anyway, this is a very one-dimensional way he's looking at it.
Are oppressive to us. This is the same system. It's another species in the exact same genus, and that genus is Marxism, which is a way of thinking about the world. And the goal is always to seize the means of control of the production of man and history.
Seize the means of control of the production of
history and society.
And history and society. What?
World. And the goal is always to seize the means.
The goal is always to seize the
control
means
of the production
of man
and history and society. Marx merely believed it was through economic means. Now it's through socio-cultural means. The evolution into this sometimes called Western Marxism began in the 1920s.
Okay, it's not to seize the means of cultural production. What the hell does that even mean? How can you seize the means of cultural production? Okay, it means that it is in a way a cultural revolution. It's supposed to be a cultural revolution, not seizing the means of cultural production. It's interesting to put it that way. The idea is whether we are producing a culture that, because culture is always reproducing itself. Whatever the culture is, it's reproducing itself. Whether it's capitalism, it's reproducing itself. Whatever the culture is, it's reproducing. It's a ritual. I mean, you could have an ancient Chinese society reproducing itself, right? So the idea is to be conscious of that reproduction, basically. It's to be conscious of that reproduction. And when you're conscious of your ritual production in society, you ask, is capitalism the best way to organize? Is capitalism the best theology? Is the best oikonomia? And what is capitalism? Is giving decision-making power, the most decision-making power, to the fastest exploiters. The best exploiters, the people who can delegate in the positive sense, exploit in a negative sense, delegate the best managerial class. And there's plenty of problems with it.
We had a Russian Revolution in 1917, and this did not happen in Europe. And the Marxists in Europe were confused. And so Antonio Gramsci sat down and wrote out some things. And George Lukács sat down and wrote History and Class Consciousness after the failure of the revolution in Hungary. And they wrote what became cultural Marxism. The idea that we have to enter the cultural institutions in order to change them from within, because Western culture has something about it that's repelling socialism.
So here's a crucial thing. It's hard to basically disentangle, right? Spivak, and this is in my defense of Spivak video that you can watch. Spivak is a Gramsci scholar, and Gramsci himself, from my reading of Gramsci, is very good in terms of cultural critique. But the people who cite Gramsci, a lot of the interpretations go off the rail and go straight into, I mean, it depends on your interpretation of Gramsci here. But I guess it's a debate on the interpretation of Gramsci to make that a weaker argument. I personally think Gramsci doesn't go in the extreme identity politics perspective, and that's because I'm influenced from a perspective of Spivakian view of Gramsci. uh, it's a difficult one.
So we have to go inside and change the culture to make it socialist. Now, you aren't allowed to talk about cultural Marxism now. They've categorized this as a conspiracy theory. They say that it is anti-Semitic. This is not true. Antonio Gramsci wrote books. George Lukács wrote books. You can read those books. They have a philosophy. If they don't like the name cultural Marxism, we can use the name that other people at the time used, Western Marxism. So much like, I don't know, a virus adapting to the conditions, it changed to try to infect a new host. It worked in feudal societies. Marxism took over in Russia. It took over later in China. It took over in all of these kind of agriculturally driven feudal societies, but it wouldn't work in actual capitalist nations because Marx was wrong. Then several Germans from the Frankfurt School.
Okay, it wouldn't work in actual capitalist nations because Marx was wrong. And in a way, he's right about that, because Marx was wrong about the durability of capitalism. Marx was a little bit over-deterministic. I mean, you'll see.
Started to study this phenomenon in more depth, and they evolved the idea further. They evolved the idea into what's called critical Marxism. They developed what's called the critical theory. And Max Horkheimer, who designed the critical theory, explained the critical theory. And what did he say? He said, well, what we came to realize was that Marx was wrong about one thing. Capitalism does not immiserate the work.
He didn't do the first, second, he didn't do the chronology correctly, I don't think.
It allows him to build a better life. So I developed the critical theory because it is not possible to articulate the vision of a good society on the terms of the existing society. So critical Marxism criticizes the entirety of the existing society. Everything is somehow needing to be subjected to Marxist conflict analysis. But how is that to be done? They sought an answer through the middle part of the 20th century, and World War II breaks out. The Frankfurt School comes to America, which in this metaphor is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because gain of function began to happen on the Marxist virus very quickly.
What? That's fucking crazy jump.
America and American universities adopted these professors from Germany. And Herbert Marcuse, writing in the 1960s, said extremely clearly,
he just said it's like COVID.
This writing in 1969, not only did he say capitalism delivers the goods, gives people a good life, makes them wealthy and comfortable and happy, he also said that.
And that's why we have to look at Gabriel Rockhill's critiques of the Frankfurt School, because the Frankfurt School doesn't have their hands clean. I don't like all of Gabriel Rockhill's critiques. I defend Zizek. I defend Spivak. I have to have I hope I can have a debate with him someday.
That the working class is no longer going to be the base of the revolution because of these things. In other words, we don't have to be responsible to the working class anymore, which opens up the ability for Marxists who are seeking power to make friends with the corporations. The bosses are no longer the enemy, they're an opportunity. Because the working class is irrelevant. He said the energy is somewhere else. He said it's in the racial minorities, the sexual minorities, the feminists, the outsiders. That's who he said have the energy for a Marxist revolution in the West, not the working class. And so Marxism was able to evolve to abandon the working class. And so what did they do? Well, all they had studied for 30 years was what they called the culture industry.
So that's a very interesting pivot. So this is dangerous. It's so dangerous. The working class votes for this guy. And the left does everything in its power to make this guy have a platform. Oh my goodness.
An industry that commodifies and packages.
The deplatforming culture created this guy. Deplatforming culture creates Andrew Tate.
Culture and sells it back to people. So supposedly stripped of what it actually is. Empty. Abstract now. And so what, of course, did they do? They seized the means of production of the culture industry, because that's what they do. And so they started to transform the culture industry to sell racial, sexual, gender, sexuality-based agitprop, as though that were genuine culture. And so we get concepts like cultural appropriation. We get concepts like cultural relevance, cultural this, cultural that, cultural everything. And it's all provided in pastiche. It's all provided as a mockery of what's really going on. And this evolved in America's highly racialized context. And we ended up with woke, a form of identity-based Marxism, a constellation of Marxist species that all work with the same operating premise but locate themselves in different, and I'll use the German term here for this, folk. LGBTQ is a folk. And they get folkish identity there and become activists. The black community is a folk. How do I know? That's what W.E.B. Du Bois said it would be when he laid down the foundations that became critical race theory later. They think of themselves as nations. Don't they all have flags? Don't they put them on?
Yeah, see, this is the thing, right? Like, again, same with Gramsci. Like, W.E.B. Du Bois is good to read in many ways. It's the modern interpretation, the modern renditions of it that just go off the rail.
Would be when he laid down the foundations that became critical race theory later. They think of themselves as nations. Don't they all have flags? Don't they put them on your buildings like colonizers? Don't they hang them in your streets? They think of themselves as occupying nations, but they see themselves as bound together, just like the various colonized nations around the world, and seeking liberation from Western civilization. And so we end up with Western Marxism taking many forms, but with one overarching approach. And the approach that they use, I started off by saying, is Maoist, not merely Marxist. Now you know the theory is Marx. It's just evolved into different species to attack the West at its weakest points, through our tolerance, through our acceptance, through our openness, through our generosity, through our best traits, actually. The things that we should be proud of being, the things that we are proud of being. But Mao Zedong knew how to use identity politics. I don't know how you study in Europe, but in America we have very red-washed education, as we might say. The communists have stripped out all education about communism entirely. You don't learn about it in America at all. So we don't learn anything about Mao. And maybe you don't know this, but I tell this to American audiences and they're shocked. Mao used identity politics. He created 10 identities in China. 5, he labeled red for communist. 5, he labeled black for fascist. And he categorized people into these identity categories. What they are doesn't really matter. Of course, they were communists. They were things like landlord and rich farmer and things like this. Right-winger is a bad category in and of itself, by the way. Conservative, all of them, bad. Bad influences, that's another one. You could be a bad influence for just thinking the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing at any time, or because the government decides it doesn't like you. These are the bad categories. And if you have a bad category, very importantly, your children have a bad category by default. So they create a social pressure for your children to identify as revolutionaries.
He's talking about the Cultural Revolution. You know, the Cultural Revolution was a response to Western colonialism. Okay? It was a response to the Boxer Revolution failing. You could start history at any point you want in order to make any point you want. You know, this is what happens with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Talk to one guy, he starts history whenever he wants to make the point he already was going to make, even if history didn't fucking matter in the first place.
At which point they get a red identity, a communist identity, a good identity, and they get rewarded for it. And the youth led the revolution in China because Mao did this, identity politics through the children in the schools. This should feel very uncomfortable to you. Because here we have, at least in the United States, we tell our children.
I don't understand why we're calling the Mao.
Being white is bad. Being white is oppressive. You automatically hurt people of other races by your very existence. But by the way, if you become queer, we'll celebrate you. And you can create a radical army of people who identify as gender minorities and sexual minorities at 7 years old. You can lead them into paths of puberty blockers and transition, medical transition, which of course Big Pharma profits off of. At 7 years old, behind their parents' back.
What he's able to do here is he's able to basically round up all the crazy points, and he's right in a way. Do round up all the straw man and make this whole narrative, and it's amazing. It's amazing work in a way, but the problem is that the left doesn't see that how it feeds him.
Reason for this. It's the same program that Mao Zedong used to radicalize the youth in China. The only thing different is the identity categories have shifted. It's Maoist cultural revolution with American characteristics, and it's being exported to Europe. And just like how critical race theory has come to Europe, even though it doesn't make sense, it will come to Europe, whether it makes sense or not, and you'll have a cultural revolution here too. You guys even had a kind of offshoot one in 2020. George Floyd dies in Minnesota, which has nothing to do with you. And you guys have statues coming down in Europe. Total nonsense. It doesn't matter though. The point is to destroy Western civilization from within using Maoist techniques. One last point about Mao to kind of drive that point home.
Again, the whole destroy Western civilization. The Western civilization is already dead. And what killed it wasn't the communists. It was neoliberalism killed the Western civilization. What happened was that bourgeois thinking came into the temple. What happened was that we had citizens united. What happened was that money corrupted even the positive thing that he's talking about. Money corrupted even the positive things of Western civilization, whatever those positive things were. That didn't have to do with money. And all of that became neoliberal cost-benefit analysis. The West has already died. Trying to defend the West is asinine, as King of the Hill said.
Mao said in 1942 that his formula to transform China was called unity, criticism, unity. First, you try to create the desire for unity. Then you criticize people for not living up to that. Then you bring them into unity under a new standard. Does that feel like what you're being put through? But the words are different. We use words like inclusion and belonging. We'll have a place where everybody feels like they belong. We just want to have an inclusive space. But unfortunately, you have racist ideas, and we have to criticize you for those. You need to criticize yourself for those. You need to go study Shuishi in Mandarin, exactly like Mao said. And then we can bring you into unity under a new standard, which Mao called socialist discipline, which we in the West would not buy. We call it in the West inclusion. And so we have this new program, and within inclusion we have, or above
is he talking about keeping
inclusion, actually, we have sustainability. We have a sustainable and inclusive future. I see the Agenda 2030 here with an X over it. The sustainable and inclusive future is the new socialist standard, that we will have freedom under socialist discipline. And Mao said the way that that will work is through what he called democratic centralism. We call that stakeholder capitalism. And my shot at the World Economic Forum is taken, because it's one of the things coordinating this. My shot at the United Nations is taken, because it's one of the things that's coordinating this. So woke is Marxism. It's advancing through Maoist cultural revolution. It's using Americanized identity categories, and while some of those will not work in Europe, I guarantee you the colonial aspect will. They will find your weakness. They will adapt the theory to fit, because it's like a virus that will evolve to its host. And Europe is at great risk. Now, the last thing I'll mention is this risk is twofold. When you endure Marxist provocation, Marxist strategy is always of the same type. It's called middle-level violence. They don't come at you with full-blown Bolshevik assault very often. It's middle-level violence. They provoke, which means if you give in and you do like Jean-Paul Sartre said in his foreword to The Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon, the post-colonial book, he said, the violence is coming. So Europe's best bet is to give it away so that they don't kill you. They'll murder you and take it, or maybe you can give it away, give your culture away, give your countries away, and they'll let you live. They're coming for you. And this is what Europe needs to learn. That's what he says in the foreword of Wretched of the Earth. You can read it for yourself, probably in the original French that I can't read. And I think that's the path Europe has followed. So you can give away. That's one side, because they provoke at the middle. Or you can react and overreact, which sadly Europe has had a rough history in the last century with overreactions. And if you overreact, what will they do? They will weaponize your overreaction for a century, forever, and gain moral authority so that you end up having to give it away later anyway. So you have to stand firm in your principles, but you have to do so cleverly. You have to do so understanding that you're being provoked, which means you don't react as the provocateur wants you to react. You have to outsmart them, which is not possible unless you know the diagnosis of your problem. It's a Polish proverb, never attempt to cure what you don't understand. Woke is Marxism, evolved to attack the West. If you don't understand that, you will not act correctly. You will not cure it, and it will conquer your countries.
Interesting. Never
Which is not possible unless you know the diagnosis of
cure what you can't, and his understanding is quite limited. So it's kind
your
of
problem.
funny.
It's a Polish proverb, never attempt to cure what you don't understand. Woke is Marxism, evolved to attack the West. If you don't understand that, you will not act correctly. You will not cure it, and it will conquer your countries. It will conquer all of Europe, and we will have a very, very long, sustainable, and inclusive future with absolutely no freedom. Because the goal is to make us into what they call global citizens. Have you heard this term? This term is nonsense.
Neoliberal subjects.
There's no global sovereign, so there is no global citizenship. There's no...
See, the problem is that right-wing people think that the word neoliberalism is like what they use, is like this word that we use for everything. But in actuality, neoliberalism is their globalism.
relationship because there's no ruler, and we don't want a ruler of the globe. It's a nonsense term. But they tell you, if you actually read their literature, what is a global citizen? It's somebody, I kid you not, I make no joke. They say this themselves. It's somebody who supports the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations Agenda 2030. That's a global citizen. And they say, what are the rights of a global citizen? This is in a book about global citizenship education published 2 years ago. What are the rights of a global citizen? And the answer, one paragraph later, is we're not that interested in rights with global citizenship. It's more about global responsibilities. In other words, slavery. This is a pivotal moment in the history of the Western world.
If there's something that we learn from the West, it's responsibility, okay? It's taking responsibility for that which we do not deem ourselves being responsible for. That's not slavery. Slavery is not responsibility, okay? And this guy calls himself a conservative. That's a funny line.